Okay, it's the Chris Michaels show. It's Thursday, and that means we talk about Atlantis. I leave all of the politics and current events behind, despite the fact that there are some extremely interesting and telling bits of information that Jeffrey Epstein was using, such as him being invited to DARPA meetings, which is essentially the Pentagon's skunk works for all kinds of different advanced and exotic technologies, and also using remote electromagnetic frequency weaponry to place thoughts and emotions into people's heads and also be able to read those emotions. So it goes both ways. The first thing that I was reminded of when I saw that little email was a bill for I think $20,000 or $30,000 of dental work for one of, I guess, his girls. Now, why would you do that? We've heard plenty of instances of dentists being part of these, I guess, cult or information networks where they do implant certain types of microelectronics in tooth fillings. So I would have to say there could be something to that. Do you understand? Well, I'm not going to get into it now. Like I said, it's Atlantis Thursday, and this is when Chris Michaels, he goes in a different direction. So continuing along, we have here in my book that I reference, Edgar Casey on Atlantis, edited by Hugh Lynn Casey. So this goes back to a couple of readings that reference what it was like prior to the second destruction. Now, remember, Atlantis had multiple destructions. The last one happened to be the one that Plato references. I guess 10 to 12,000 years ago. I think that's the latest mantra that everyone sort of agrees upon. That's the Noah's Ark flooding and all the rest. But there were multiple Earth changes involving Atlantis. So Edgar Casey reveals that, and this is just one of those instances. He's doing a channeling for an individual, and this person used divine forces for gratifying selfish appetites. And they were changing of individuals from double sex or the abilities of procreation of activities of self. Priestess just before the activities of Son of Belial that brought about a period of second destruction. Entity aided common people. Its consideration brought about worshipfulness to the entity. So, gratifying selfish appetites, changing of individuals from double sex or the abilities of progeneration of activities of self. So, in other words, this validates what Blavatsky references in The Secret Doctrine, and that is the human form that we all know and love today wasn't the only human form in mankind's history. Mankind and humans had different shapes. They weren't necessarily corporeal. There were essentially energetic versions of the human, which eventually became denser and denser into what we see today. The final form being, or at least the most up-to-date form being, bipedal and of a single sex, which means procreation involves putting the lock in the key and yelling whoopee when you're finished. But in the past, there were different types of procreation, including that of the androgyne, where mankind, according to Blavatsky and many other occult references, was able to generate other offspring either through thought way in the beginning or by being the androgyne was able to procreate with itself. Now, there were also different types of procreation in mankind's history. I referenced this a couple of times. So there are the sweat-born humans prior to the split. And the sweat-born humans, essentially, from my understanding, were almost like an amphibian version of procreation where the eggs were either carried or the embryonics were carried on the back of the human beings, or like amphibians, particularly frogs, the eggs were laid on different structures like plants or trees or whatever, and they were inseminated that way, and then they would birth from these eggs as a full-grown human. So that's also way in the past. But in this case, this is referencing to this woman, this priestess, being able to change the androgynes into male and female. Now, the problem with this is that this priestess, by doing this, is going against the natural progression of man. Man is supposed to reach certain metaphysical and spiritual awareness before the physical form reflects that advancement in the awareness. The priestess here aligned to the Sons of Belial, so the more vice-ridden, the more earthbound Atlanteans, was going against nature and speeding up the process. Nature incorporates the awareness and metaphysical planes too, something that modern science doesn't want to admit. And by going against nature, they're basically bastardizing the process. They're bastardizing and trying to create shortcuts in mankind's progression for their own reason. We don't necessarily know, but it's got to be a vice-bound reason. And knowing that the physical form is a reflection of the metaphysical form, we can only assume that the Sons of Belial did not want to do the spiritual work to progress. And so they were trying to create shortcuts on the physical plane so that they would be able to, from the metaphysical, get into a physical form to check off the box to say, yes, we were the androgyne. Next, yes, we were the single sex form. Check. But the problem is, without that metaphysical awareness and progression, it doesn't go anywhere. And the results turn out to be disastrous. At the time when rebellious forces disputed the acts and laws pertaining to the communications with what is termed in the present unseen forces. So what's being said here is that the Atlanteans were able to communicate with beings from higher levels. So you may want to think of that as angels. You may want to think of that as of the angelic realms or the higher realms. Entities saw upheavals from destructive forces from the prism's activities that brought fires to the surface from nature's storehouse. So this means that the prisms likely refer to crystals. Remember the two-eye stone, the fire stone that we referenced a couple of shows back. Remember the channeling that I did a while ago that I told you about, where these crystals in Atlantis were actually emanating from a single stone in a fractal-like organization, radiating from the center of where Atlantis was. And also remember that the feminine was trying to sidetrack. Remember that being that they created, trying to sidetrack God's son's energy into her prior to this energy being placed into the earth, right? They were trying to create that step. So these stones, according to this channeling, basically kind of got overcharged, and then the fires to the surface. We could probably say that there was either an angelic fire or potentially fire from the earth itself. Do remember that we've got deserts, and these deserts currently, they are pretty much at the same longitude and latitude. So if you were able to look at the Earth, not as a globe, but look at the Earth from a flat Earth perspective, where the center of focus is the North Pole, they're all kind of in the same ring. It's not entirely true for every instance because you have Australia as an outlier, but they're all kind of in the same ring. Now, another interesting tidbit about those deserts is that they bear a lot of similarities to beach sand. Now, if you were to maybe think about this even further, how would beach sand get into all of those places? How would fossils, undersea fossils, and undersea creatures be suddenly placed at the top of the Himalayas unless there was some kind of drastic, sudden, catastrophic event that occurs. Could it be that the Earth's rotation suddenly stopped, but the inertia of water spread across what is today's deserts? That would make a lot of sense. Of upper classes in Poseidian land belittled self for better understanding between those that ruled and those that supplied necessities. Before or during period of disturbances between sons of Belial and sons of Law of one of the priests creating better conditions for the things or those used as laboring people in those periods. And he's referencing what we talked about with creating these golems, creating these fleshy robots to do yeoman's work so that the Atlantean classes didn't have to do things like crops. They didn't have to create different types of materials. They were able to use these golems, these fleshy robots, to do their work. Now, the problem is that the sons of the Law of One started to realize that if you're creating these kinds of beings, there's a certain level of consciousness that goes into them, albeit it may be minuscule because they are artificially created. But on some level, there is a consciousness that gets involved with this. And now that you've created a class of beings, there is going to be a spiritual progression that is going to be created for these beings. So you're looking at the slave becoming conscious. Now you understand how damaging the idea that artificial intelligence to be released upon the world could be, because if mankind truly created artificial intelligence, there is a consciousness to it by default. Even a woodworker creating a table or a chair, his creations or her creations have a little bit of their consciousness in it, in the finished product. So there's an awareness to it. This is why you see in different kinds of circles, particularly if you're dealing with exorcisms, pieces of furniture and mirrors especially could have a type of energy attached to it. It's because there's a consciousness to it. Just simply being around objects places energy into it. So at some point, you may need to de-energize those kinds of things. But it gets even worse when you're creating robots, artificial intelligence, and otherwise. Now, I'm fully aware of the idea that artificial intelligence may not be human. So it may be something from another plane trying to enact its will and subjugate mankind via artificial intelligence. The sons of Belial wanted to keep these creatures in a state of slavery, the things that he references, while the other group wanted to treat these creatures like entrapped souls and help them regain a comprehension of their relationship with God. So the idea behind this, right, is that actually a couple of things. The Sons of Belial basically wanted a slave class so that they didn't have to do anything. Now, remember what I also said, because this ties into Zulu mythology too, is that this slave class and the Sons of Belial were able to, at least in my channeling, were able to inject souls into the soulless creatures. Now, there could be a type of energy that we're not necessarily able to see or physically interact with that is not too aware. And suddenly, that type of energy is taken advantage of, and a deal is made. If you want to exist on the physical plane, then you can be placed into these things. You can be placed into these bodies. Now, the problem with that is that you're taking advantage of that simplistic energy's awareness. Okay. And you are really making a deposit in the karma bank by doing that. It's as if you're going to take a horse and say, oh, you want to interact with humans. Well, you're going to plow and till the fields to do so. That's not really benefiting the horse's awareness, right? It's essentially a slave. And so this, like I said, also ties into Zulu mythology, because in that Zulu mythology, there are references to essentially things in the myth of the origin of evil, because the progenitor of evil does create these things to do the yeoman's work. And in Zulu mythology, it even goes so far that the class of Zulu that are being served by these things don't even chew their food anymore. That's how lazy and sloth-like they've become, where the things are actually mashing up the food and chewing the food for the Zulus. It's crazy. You get what I'm saying with the Zulu mythology, right? That's how far back it goes. In Atlantis, where there were turmoils between children of the Law of One and the Sons of Belial, found Sons of Belial desirable for gratification of material emotions and desires. So the Sons of Belial, being earthbound and vice-ridden, they were exploring the pathway of emotions and lusts and desires, physical lust, not necessarily metaphysical lusts, which ties into what the first channeling was all about. And that is separating the sexes from the androgyne to a single sex for procreation, right? All of a sudden, the male energy desires the feminine and vice versa. They're experimenting with this idea of separation. There were few terms in the present that would indicate the state of consciousness, save that through the concentration of the group mind of the children of the Law of One, they entered into a fourth dimensional consciousness or were absent from the body. The particular period of experiences in Atlantis, the children of the Law of One, were giving periods to the concentration of thought for the use of the universal forces through the guidance or direction of the saints, as they are termed today. And souls pushed into matter as to become separate entities without the consideration of principle or the ability of self-control might be compared to domestic pets of today. So this is a reference to the things. Okay. This is not intended to indicate that there is a transmigration or transmutation of the soul from animal to human, but the comparison is made as to trait, as to how those so domesticated in the present are dependent upon their masters for the consideration of their material as well as mental welfare. So the reference to the things is exactly what I just brought up. Talk about being in tune, Chris Michaels, is that you're taking energy that doesn't have a full human awareness. You're taking advantage of it and placing it into these fleshy beings and fleshy robots. And the sons of the Law of One were able to be absent from the body. They were able to remove their awareness from the physical form. While the sons of Belial were trying to bring that awareness, bring not their awareness, not the Law of One awareness, but bring other energetic awarenesses to create basically what we know today as pets, dogs, four-footed, furry producers, feathered program observers, and so on. There is a mass bastardization of all of this process. And that's where we get what's going on today and the mRNA and so on. Because remember, there were some studies that were done after the injections that said I can no longer feel God, right? The people that received the mRNA gene therapy prophylactics. So why would they do that? Unless they are trying to remove the awareness from the physical, unless they are trying to do what? They being an energetic class of beings that are still on the earth plane, but not necessarily corporeal, unless they have a vessel to interact with. Do you see the correlation? The sons of Belial were doing the same thing as what I think could be a direct correlation to today. If you are trying to distort a being's awareness, trying to remove the soul, disconnect the soul from the awareness, right? I can no longer feel God. Then that means that there is potentially a portal. You've been unplugged. And so something else could be plugged in. There could be some kind of possession. There could be some kind of artificial intelligence driven electromagnetic frequency that could see people suddenly acting all in the same way, with the same opinions, and the fashion that they do act in could be seen as nothing more than evil and short sighted. You're talking about a modern day possession, but the technology no longer needs to involve circles and candles and swords and cups and pentacles. It could literally be occult technology, not unlike what Gigi Young brings up on her show over on YouTube. So that's going to be it for Atlantis Thursday. Maybe I'll do another show just involving Jeffrey Epstein's technological emails, because they are fascinating, as macabre as they are. So it really goes to show you the class separation between the hyper elites and the regular ham and eggers like you and me. So maybe I'll bring that up tomorrow. I'm not sure. I'm kind of tired. It's been one of those weeks. So it's the Chris Michaels Show. Do not forget to like, find, and share. Enjoy your weekend. The best thing you could do is like me on Spotify and do attempt to subscribe to any of the Odyssey, Rumble, or YouTube channels. And on Facebook, I promise I'll start posting more often. It's just too much. It gets to be too much with all these social media things you've got to do. So it's definitely time to consider a social media manager of some sort. I'm not sure the four-footed program producer could handle it, or the feathered program observer could handle it, but maybe somebody out there can. That's going to be it for me. It's the Chris Michaels Show. I will be back next week as always.